"Doctor, please, just one last wish," the patient whispered with tears in his eyes. The female doctor froze. She had spent years saving lives, but never once had a patient asked for something like this. What he wanted wasn't medicine, wasn't money. It was something no one in that hospital could have expected. Stay with me until the end, because this story will leave you speechless. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's begin. Dr. Elena Martinez had always been different from other doctors at St. Mary's Hospital in Chicago. At 32, she carried herself with quiet confidence that made both patients and colleagues feel at ease. Her dark hair was always pulled back neatly, her white coat spotless, and her gentle voice had a way of calming even the most frightened patients. But what made her truly special wasn't just her medical skills. It was the way she listened, really listened, when people spoke to her. Elena had worked at the hospital for 8 years. She'd seen joy, pain, miracles, and heartbreak. She'd delivered babies, saved lives, and yes, she'd also watched people take their last breath. But through it all, she maintained her compassion without letting it break her. That balance wasn't easy. Many doctors learned to keep their distance, to protect themselves from getting too attached. Elena was different. She believed that healing wasn't just about medicine. It was about connection, about seeing each patient as a whole person, not just a condition to treat. The morning started like any other Tuesday. Elena arrived at the hospital at 6:30, grabbed her usual coffee from the cafeteria, and began her rounds. Room 204, Mrs. Chen, recovering well from surgery. Room 206, Mr. Williams, diabetes management going smoothly. Room 208, teenage car accident victim, stable and healing. Everything felt routine, predictable, normal. But room 210 was different. James Parker had been admitted 3 weeks ago with advanced lung cancer. The diagnosis was terminal. Stage 4 spread to multiple organs, maybe 2 months to live. Elena had been assigned as his primary physician, and from their first meeting, something about him caught her attention. He wasn't like other terminal patients she'd treated. There was no anger, no denial, no desperate pleading for experimental treatments. Instead, James seemed almost peaceful, as if he'd already made his peace with what was coming. James was 45 years old, never married, no children. His file showed he'd worked as a high school history teacher for 20 years. His emergency contact was listed as his sister who lived across the country, but she hadn't visited once since his admission. The nurses mentioned that he rarely had visitors. A few former colleagues had stopped by in the first week, but lately his room stayed quiet. What struck Elena most was how polite he always was. Every morning when she checked on him, he'd thank her for her time. When she asked about his pain levels, he'd answer honestly but never complained. When she explained test results or treatment options, he listened carefully and asked thoughtful questions. He treated everyone, from the head nurse to the cleaning staff, with the same respect and kindness. Elena found herself looking forward to their conversations. James had a sharp mind and a gentle sense of humor that made even difficult medical discussions feel lighter. He'd ask about her day, remember details about her life that she'd mentioned in passing, and somehow always managed to make her smile even when delivering serious news about his condition. But this morning felt different the moment she walked into his room. James was sitting up in bed, staring out the window at the city skyline. The morning light cast soft shadows across his face, and Elena could see he'd been crying. His hands were folded in his lap, and there was something in his posture that made her heart tighten. "Good morning, James," she said softly, closing the door behind her. "How are you feeling today?" He turned to look at her, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Not fear, not sadness, but something deeper. Something that looked like longing mixed with resignation. "Dr. Martinez," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I need to ask you something important." Elena pulled the chair closer to his bed and sat down. She'd learned over the years that when patients said they needed to ask something important, it was best to give them her full attention. Of course. What's on your mind? James was quiet for a long moment, his fingers picking at the edge of his blanket. Elena waited. She'd discovered that silence often encouraged people to share things they might otherwise keep hidden. Finally, he looked at her directly. I've been thinking a lot lately about my life, about what I've done, what I haven't done, about what matters. Elena nodded gently. That's natural, James. When we're facing serious illness, it's common to reflect on our lives. I know, he said, but it's more than that. I've realized something. I've spent 45 years on this earth, and I've never experienced love, real love, not the kind you read about in books or see in movies. I've never felt that connection with another person. Elena felt her chest tighten. She'd had similar conversations with other patients before, but something about the way James spoke made this feel different. I was always shy, he continued, always focused on work, on my students, on other people's needs. I told myself there would be time for romance later, time to find someone, settle down, start a family, but later never came. And now, well, now there's no time left. His voice cracked slightly on the last words, and Elena had to fight back her own emotions. She reached out and gently placed her hand on his arm. James, you've touched so many lives through your teaching. Love comes in many forms, and the impact you've had on your students is a kind of love too. He smiled sadly. I know, and I'm grateful for that. But I'm talking about something else, something I've never had. The feeling of being chosen by someone, of being someone's first thought in the morning and last thought at night, of having someone who sees all of you, the good and the bad, and chooses to stay anyway. Elena felt tears forming in her eyes. She'd never heard anyone describe love so beautifully, so honestly. James took a shaky breath. The doctors told me yesterday that the treatment isn't working, that I probably have weeks, not months. And I know this sounds crazy, but I can't stop thinking about what I'm going to miss. I'll never know what it feels like to hold someone I love, to wake up next to them, to plan a future together, even if that future is short. The room fell silent, except for the soft beeping of monitors and the distant sounds of hospital life in the hallway. Elena sat there, holding his arm, feeling the weight of his words settle around them. Then James looked at her with those kind, tired eyes and said the words that would change everything. Doctor, please, just one last wish. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She had no idea what he was about to ask, but something in his voice, something in the way he was looking at her, made her heart race. What is it, James? She whispered. What he said next left her completely speechless. I want to spend my last days learning what love feels like, he said, his voice barely audible. Not just any love, but the kind that makes you feel alive, even when you're dying. The kind where someone sees you, really sees you, and chooses to be with you anyway. Elena felt her mouth go dry. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither of them knew how to cross. James, she began carefully, I'm not sure I understand what you're asking. He shifted in his bed, wincing slightly from the pain that had become his constant companion. Dr. Martinez, I know this is impossible. I know it's inappropriate. I know you're my doctor and I'm your patient. But I also know I have maybe 3 weeks left to live, and I can't stop thinking about dying without ever knowing what it feels like to be loved. Elena's medical training kicked in. The part of her that was supposed to maintain professional boundaries, that was supposed to keep a safe distance. But another part of her, the part that had been drawn to James's kindness and intelligence over the past 3 weeks, felt something stirring that she couldn't quite name. James, I care about you, she said slowly. You know that. But what you're asking, it's not something I can give you, not as your doctor. I'm not asking you as my doctor, he replied. I'm asking you as a human being, someone who's shown me more kindness in 3 weeks than I've felt in years. Someone who makes me smile even when everything hurts. Someone who, if I'm being completely honest, I found myself thinking about long after visiting hours end. Elena felt her cheeks flush. She'd noticed it too, the way their conversations had gradually shifted from purely medical to something more personal. The way she found herself lingering in his room longer than necessary. The way she looked forward to seeing his face each morning. But this was different. This was crossing a line she'd never even considered crossing before. "James," she whispered, "you don't know what you're asking. My career, my reputation, everything I've worked for could be destroyed if anyone found out." He nodded slowly. "I know. And that's exactly why I know you won't do it. Because you're smart and professional and you have a whole life ahead of you. But I had to ask. Because if I didn't, I'd spend whatever time I have left wondering what would have happened if I'd been brave enough to tell you how I feel." Elena stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She walked to the window, her back to him, trying to process what was happening. In 8 years of practicing medicine, she'd never faced anything like this. "How do you feel?" she asked without turning around. "Like I'm alive for the first time in months," he said simply. "Like maybe there's still something beautiful waiting for me before the end." She turned to face him, and the look in his eyes nearly broke her heart. There was no manipulation there, no attempt to pressure her, just raw honesty and a vulnerability that made her chest ache. "James, even if I wanted to, even if I could somehow justify it to myself, how would it work? You're in the hospital, you're sick. There are nurses checking on you every few hours." He smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him all morning. "I've been thinking about that too. My sister called yesterday. She finally wants to visit, wants to take me home for my final weeks. Let me die in familiar surroundings," she said. Elena felt her pulse quicken. "You're being discharged?" "If I want to be. Dr. Richardson said they can set up hospice care at my house. Pain management, comfort measures, everything I need." He paused. "Everything except what I really want." The room fell quiet again. Elena could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of the decision hanging between them. She thought about all the reasons she should say no, the ethics, the complications, the risks. But she also thought about James lying in that bed night after night, facing his mortality alone. She thought about the way he remembered small details about her life, the way he always asked about her day before discussing his own pain. She thought about how he'd become the bright spot in her morning rounds, how she'd started choosing his room for last so she could spend more time there without rushing to the next patient. "If I said yes," she heard herself saying, "if I even considered this insane idea, what exactly would you want from me?" James's eyes filled with hope and something else, something that looked like love already beginning to bloom. "Just time," he said. "Just the chance to wake up next to someone who cares about me, to have dinner with someone who wants to hear about my day, to hold hands while watching a movie, to know what it feels like when someone chooses to stay when they could easily leave." Elena felt tears threatening to spill over. Those were such simple things, such ordinary moments that most people took for granted. But for James, they represented everything he'd never had and everything he was about to lose forever. 3 weeks, she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Maybe less," he replied honestly. "But I promise you, if you give me this gift, I'll make every moment count. I'll never take a single day for granted. And when it's over, you'll know that you gave someone the most beautiful ending to their story that they could have asked for." Elena closed her eyes, knowing that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't even imagine. When she opened them again, James was watching her with an expression of quiet hope mixed with acceptance, as if he was prepared for whatever answer she might give. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course," he replied. "Take all the time you need. But Elena, whatever you decide, thank you for listening. Thank you for seeing me as more than just a patient in a bed." She nodded, unable to trust her voice, and walked toward the door. As she reached for the handle, she heard him speak one last time. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think the saddest thing would be dying alone. But now I realize the saddest thing would be dying without ever telling you that meeting you has been the best part of being sick." Elena's hand froze on the door handle. She stood there for a long moment, her back to him, feeling the weight of his words settle deep in her chest. When she finally left the room, she knew that nothing would ever be the same. Elena spent the rest of her shift in a fog. Every patient she saw, every chart she reviewed, every conversation she had with colleagues felt distant and muffled, as if she was watching her own life through thick glass. James's words kept echoing in her mind, mixing with the sound of her footsteps in the hospital corridors. By the time her shift ended at 7 that evening, she'd made up her mind to say no. It was the only logical choice, the only professional choice, the only choice that made sense for someone who'd worked so hard to build her career, her reputation, her life. But as she sat in her car in the hospital parking lot, engine running, she couldn't bring herself to drive home. Instead, she found herself thinking about a conversation she'd had with her grandmother years ago, just before the old woman died. Her grandmother had been 93, sharp as a knife until the very end, lying in a hospital bed, much like the one James occupied now. Elena had been a medical student then, young and idealistic, full of textbook knowledge but lacking real-world experience. "Mija," her grandmother had said in that papery voice that comes with age, "let me tell you something about regret. You think the things you do wrong will haunt you, but that's not true. It's the things you don't do, the chances you don't take, the love you don't give. Those are the ghosts that follow you." Elena had nodded politely, thinking her grandmother was just rambling, the way old people sometimes do. But now, sitting in that parking lot, those words hit her like a physical blow. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found Dr. Richardson's number. He was the attending physician who'd been overseeing James's case, and she knew he'd still be at the hospital. "Richardson," he answered on the second ring. "Dr. Richardson, it's Elena Martinez. I wanted to ask you about James Parker in room 210. I understand his sister wants to take him home." There was a pause on the other end. "Yes," she called this afternoon. "Wants to set up hospice care at his house. Honestly, it might be better for him. More comfortable, more personal. Why do you ask?" Elena's heart was pounding so hard, she was sure he could hear it through the phone. "I was wondering if you'd need someone to coordinate the transition, help with the hospice setup, make sure his pain management protocols are properly transferred." Another pause. Longer this time. "Elena, that's thoughtful of you, but hospice has their own medical team. They're very thorough. Parker will be in good hands." "Of course," she said quickly. I've been treating him for 3 weeks. I feel responsible for ensuring his comfort during this transition." Richardson's voice softened. "Elena, I know you care about your patients. It's one of your best qualities. But sometimes we have to learn to let go. Parker's case is terminal. There's nothing more we can do for him medically. The kindest thing is to let hospice take over and allow him to die with dignity." "You're right," she replied, though the words felt like sand in her mouth. "I understand." After she hung up, Elena sat in her car for another 20 minutes, watching other hospital staff come and go. Some looked tired, others relieved to be heading home. A few looked the way she felt, like they were carrying something heavy they couldn't quite name. Finally, she drove home to her small apartment downtown. It was a tidy place, professionally decorated, everything in its proper place. She'd lived there for 4 years, and it had always felt like a sanctuary. Tonight it felt like a museum, beautiful and cold and lifeless. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat on her couch, trying to watch the news. But the images on the screen blurred together, meaningless noise that couldn't drown out the conversation replaying in her head. Her phone buzzed with a text message. For a wild moment, her heart jumped, thinking it might be James. But it was just her sister Maria, checking in from California. "How's work? Haven't heard from you in a while." Elena stared at the message for a long time before typing back. "Work's fine, same as always." But as soon as she sent it, she realized how untrue that was. Nothing about work felt the same. Nothing about anything felt the same. She tried calling Maria back, thinking maybe talking to someone would help her process what was happening. But when her sister answered, cheerful and chatty, Elena found she couldn't explain what was troubling her. How could she tell Maria that a patient had asked her to spend his final weeks pretending to love him? How could she explain that part of her wanted to say yes? Instead, she listened to Maria talk about her kids, her husband, her job, all the normal complications of a normal life. When she hung up, the silence in her apartment felt heavier than before. Elena took a long shower, hoping the hot water would wash away the confusion. But even as she stood under the spray, she kept thinking about James's face when he'd described never knowing love, the quiet desperation in his voice when he talked about dying without ever feeling chosen. She thought about her own life, her own carefully constructed world of schedules and responsibilities and professional achievements. When was the last time she'd felt truly alive? When was the last time she'd done something that scared her? Something that mattered beyond her next performance review or medical conference? The truth was, she couldn't remember. That night, Elena lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through scenarios in her mind. What if she said yes? What if she actually went through with James's impossible request? The logistics alone seemed overwhelming. She'd have to take time off work, probably use vacation days she'd been saving for a trip to Europe she kept putting off. She'd have to lie to colleagues, friends, family about where she was going and why. But the bigger question was whether she could actually do it. Could she spend 3 weeks with a dying man, pretending to be in love with him? Could she hold his hand, share meals with him, sleep beside him, all while knowing it was temporary, knowing it would end with his death? And if she could do those things, what would it cost her emotionally? What would it mean for her future relationships? Her ability to trust her own feelings? On the other hand, what would it cost her if she said no? Would she spend the rest of her career wondering what might have happened? Would she think about James every time she had a terminal patient, wondering if she'd missed a chance to give someone the most meaningful gift possible? Elena rolled over and looked at her alarm clock. 2:30 in the morning. In 5.5 hours, she'd be back at the hospital, making her rounds, checking on patients, including James. He'd be waiting for her answer, probably pretending to read or sleep, but really just watching the door, hoping she'd walk in with something other than a polite rejection. She thought about what he'd said about her being the bright spot in his morning. The truth was, he'd become the bright spot in hers too. Their conversations had become the part of her day she looked forward to most. Not because he was dying, not because she pitied him, but because he was kind and funny and genuinely interested in her as a person. When was the last time someone had looked at her the way James did? Not as Dr. Martinez, the competent physician, but as Elena, the woman who liked old movies and couldn't cook to save her life and still got nervous before giving presentations. She thought about her dating life, or rather, the lack of it. There had been a few relationships over the years, but nothing that had lasted. Medicine was a demanding field, and she'd always chosen her career over romance when push came to shove. She told herself there would be time for love later, after she'd established herself, after she'd achieved her professional goals. But lately, she'd started to wonder if later would ever come. She was 32, successful, financially stable, everything she'd thought she wanted. So why did she feel so empty sometimes? Why did she lie awake at night wondering if this was all there was? Maybe that's why James's request had hit her so hard. Maybe she saw something of herself in his regret, his realization that life was slipping away while he waited for the right moment to truly live it. Elena sat up in bed and turned on the lamp. She pulled out a notebook she kept in her nightstand and started making a list. Not a pros and cons list, not a logical analysis of the situation, but something else. She wrote down everything James had told her about himself over the past 3 weeks. His love of history, his passion for teaching, his quiet sense of humor, the way he worried about his students, wondered if he'd made a difference in their lives. His relationship with his sister, complicated by years of distance but still rooted in love. As she wrote, Elena realized she wasn't just thinking about a patient anymore. She was thinking about a man, a complete person with dreams and fears and a story that deserved a better ending than dying alone in a hospital bed. She thought about what he'd asked for. Not sex, not some fantasy romance, but simple human connection. The chance to wake up next to someone who cared about him. Quiet dinners and hand-holding and feeling like he mattered to someone. Those were things she could give him. Things that wouldn't compromise her integrity as a physician because she wouldn't be his physician anymore. Once he was discharged to hospice care, their medical relationship would be over. What happened after that would be between two adults making a choice about how to spend whatever time they had. Elena looked at the clock again. 3:15. She closed her notebook and turned off the light, but she didn't try to go back to sleep. Instead, she lay there in the darkness, feeling something shift inside her chest. Not certainty, not yet, but the beginning of a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Tomorrow, she would walk into James's room and give him an answer that would change both of their lives. She still wasn't sure what that answer would be, but for the first time since their conversation, she felt like she could breathe again. Outside her window, the city hummed with its endless activity. Somewhere out there, people were falling in love, making choices that would alter the course of their lives, taking chances on connection despite all the risks. Maybe it was time for her to join them. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching Elena's mood as she walked through the hospital's automatic doors. She'd managed maybe 2 hours of actual sleep, and her reflection in the elevator's polished steel showed the evidence. Dark circles under her eyes, hair not quite as neat as usual. The subtle signs of a woman wrestling with an impossible decision. She went through her morning routine mechanically. Coffee from the cafeteria, check her patient roster, review overnight notes from the nursing staff. Everything felt surreal, like she was moving through a dream where the familiar had become strange. James's room was last on her list, and she found herself walking slower as she approached it. Through the small window in the door, she could see him sitting up in bed, staring out at the city skyline. He looked smaller somehow, more fragile than she remembered, and the sight made her chest tighten. She knocked softly before entering. He turned toward her, and she saw the question in his eyes before he even spoke. "Good morning, Doctor." "Martinez," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "How are you today?" "I'm fine, thank you." She pulled the familiar chair closer to his bed and sat down. "How did you sleep?" "Not well," he admitted. "Too much on my mind, I suppose." They looked at each other for a moment, both aware that they were dancing around the real conversation they needed to have. "James," Elena began, then stopped. She'd rehearsed this moment in her head dozens of times during her sleepless night, but now that she was here, the words felt inadequate. "It's okay," he said gently. "If the answer is no, I understand. I never should have put you in this position." "That's just it," she replied. "I'm not sure you did put me in a position. I think maybe I was already there, and you just helped me see it." His eyebrows raised slightly, but he didn't speak. Elena took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about what you said, about love, about time, about not wanting to die without knowing what it feels like to be chosen. And I realized something. I've spent so many years being careful, being professional, being the person everyone expects me to be, that I've forgotten how to just be myself." James was very still, listening. "I also realized that I've been waiting too, not for death, but for life. For permission to take chances, to be vulnerable, to let someone see me as more than just a doctor in a white coat." "Where are you going with this?" he asked softly. Elena met his eyes directly. "I'm going with you. If the offer still stands, if you still want me to, I'd like to spend your last weeks learning what love feels like too." The silence that followed felt eternal. James stared at her, as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd heard. "Elena, are you sure? Because once we cross this line, there's no going back. For either of us." "I'm terrified," she said honestly, "but I'm also more sure of this than I've been of anything in years. Maybe that's what courage is. Doing something that scares you because it's right, not because it's safe." James reached for her hand, and she let him take it. His palm was warm, his grip gentle but certain. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we figure out how to make this work. Your sister is coming to take you home? Tomorrow if I want to go." "Do you want to go? With you?" "Yes, more than anything." Elena squeezed his hand. "Then we make it happen. I'll take a leave of absence. Tell my supervisor I need time for a family emergency. It's not entirely a lie," she added with a small smile. "What about after? When I'm gone?" James's question hung in the air between them. Elena had been trying not to think about that part, about what it would mean to love someone knowing you were going to lose them. "I don't know," she said finally. "I suppose I'll grieve, and then I'll try to figure out how to live with having loved someone completely for however long we have. That seems like a problem worth having." James brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Thank you," he whispered, "for seeing me, for choosing me, for giving me this gift." "Thank you for asking," she replied, "for being brave enough to tell me what you needed, for helping me remember that being alive and being safe aren't the same thing." They sat there for a while, holding hands, both of them aware that they'd just made a decision that would define whatever time they had left together. Outside, the rain had started to fall harder against the windows. But inside room 210, something beautiful was beginning. James Parker passed away peacefully on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks and 2 days after Elena first walked into his small house on Maple Street. She was lying beside him when it happened, holding his hand, watching the sunrise paint golden streaks across the bedroom wall they'd shared for 23 days. In those final weeks, they'd done everything he'd dreamed of. They cooked dinner together, even when he was too weak to stand for long. They watched old movies curled up on his couch. They talked about his students, her childhood, the books they'd both loved. They held hands during thunderstorms and laughed at silly jokes that weren't really funny. Most importantly, James learned what it felt like to be someone's first thought in the morning and last thought at night. And Elena learned that love isn't always about forever. Sometimes it's about being brave enough to open your heart completely, even when you know it will break. At his funeral, Elena met dozens of former students who spoke about the teacher who'd changed their lives. She realized that James had been wrong about one thing. He hadn't lived without love. He'd given it freely to everyone he taught, and they'd loved him back. He just hadn't recognized it for what it was. Dr. Elena Martinez returned to St. Mary's Hospital 6 weeks later, forever changed by 23 days that taught her the difference between existing and truly living. She never spoke publicly about her time with James, but those who knew her noticed something different. She smiled more, listened deeper, and never again took for granted the ordinary moments that make life extraordinary. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone isn't medicine or money. It's simply the chance to feel loved, seen, and valued in their final moments. And sometimes, in giving that gift, we discover we needed it just as much as they did.